thanks for coming out, everybody. My name's R.J. Morgan. I'm a professor here in the journalism school, and we are quite excited to have three guests with us tonight for a panel discussion on modern sports reporting. And so I'll very briefly introduce our panel, and you guys can give them some love for coming out for us. But we'll start with Dwayne Bray. Dwayne is a senior coordinating producer for ESPN and oversees the network's team of journalists who produce long-form stories on issues throughout sports. Those stories are often seen on Outside the Lines, SportsCenter, E60. Bray previously served as ESPN's on-site news editor for Monday Night Football and the NBA and college football and basketball. He's helped the network produce award-winning coverage of everything from football brain injuries in the NFL to allegations of sexual abuse at Michigan State. Prior to ESPN, he was sports editor and managing editor, Dallas Morning News. He's a native of Cleveland, Ohio, and a graduate of Cleveland State University and the Ohio State University for his master's. He made sure that I had the "the" in there for Ohio State. To his right is going to be Rick Cleveland. Many of you may know Rick Cleveland, affectionately known as the governor of Mississippi sports journalism. Rick is a native of Hattiesburg, a graduate of USM, a resident of Jackson, and has been Mississippi Today's sports columnist since 2016. Prior to that, he was a longtime reporter and columnist for the Jackson Daily News and Clarion Ledger. He's also done stints as a sports editor of the Hattiesburg American and executive director of the Mississippi Sports Hall of Fame. His work as a syndicated columnist and celebrated sports writer has appeared in numerous magazines, periodicals, and newspapers, and he's been recognized 11 times as a Mississippi Sports Writer of the Year. So that's our Rick Cleveland.
Sheesh.
And then we have Mackenzie Salmon, who currently works with Clarion Ledger as a digital sports reporter and videographer, covering high school athletics as well as Ole Miss and Mississippi State sports. She's a rising star in the world of sports journalism. She's been living in Mississippi and telling the stories of his people and places since 2017, when she graduated from Indiana University, a degree in broadcast journalism and a specialization in sports media. While there, she served as a sideline reporter for the Big Ten Student Network, covering men's and women's basketball, field hockey, and as well as serving as an anchor and host for Our Indiana. So if we could just go ahead and give a quick round of applause for our panel. And our goal tonight is really just to have a discussion about the profession of being a sports reporter, the many ways that has evolved over the years, and then sort of pivot into where we're headed from here. So my first question that I'd like just each of the three of you to talk about, and we'll start with Dwayne, is just could you tell us briefly how you got into this business and why are you a sports reporter?
Absolutely. And first, let me just thank everybody for being here tonight. I've been in Mississippi since, I think, Sunday evening. This is just a wonderful place, very hospitable place. And then these are great facilities here at the University of Mississippi. So I'm going to go back in the Northeast and I'm going to spread the word. So I wanted to start by saying that. I got into sports journalism because I was a high school baseball player, and the student newspaper covered the football and basketball team all the darn time. And I complained to my English teacher, who happens to be the advisor of the newspaper, and he says, well, why don't you write a story about the baseball team, which I was on. And of course, I was the star of that. I not only wrote it, but I was the star of my own story. But I saw my byline and said, by Dwayne Bray, staff writer. And I'm just telling you, I was hooked. At that point, nothing else in life was more important than to continue writing byline stories. And, as I grew into it, I realized that there was a strong accountability component to journalism. Even in high school, you can write a story about the lunch service and they would change it. I mean, journalism was magical. So that's my story. I started in high school and I've never done anything else in my life.
Yeah.
And I'm old, so that means I've been doing it a long time.
Right.
Well, I started actually in junior high. I was 13 years old when I was born, my dad had been the sports editor of the Hattiesburg American, my hometown newspaper. And then later on, he became the sports information director at Southern Miss. And all the sports writers who came to Hattiesburg to cover the games would all come over to our house after the games, and they would talk about their stories, what they had written about. They were having a few drinks too. It just seemed like a hell of a nice way to make a living. They were having a lot more fun than the doctors and lawyers and plumbers that I knew. And I loved reading, and I loved sports. And I just never considered really doing anything else. And I did it full-time until 2011, and at that time, Gannett was offering, the company that owned the Clarion Ledger and Daily News was offering a buyout for people with who were 50 years of age and had 20 years of experience, and I was way outside those boundaries. And at the same time, the Hall of Fame, the guy who had been the executive director for 20 years, Michael Rubenstein, passed away. And they approached me, and I had a chance to take the buyout and run the Hall of Fame and museum, which I did for 4 years. And that's the only time I ever felt like I was going to work for a living. I just, when I was writing sports, it was always, it was a job, but it was a fun job. And when the chance came to get back to writing full time, I was more than ready.
Yeah.
Well, my journey to becoming a journalist is a little different than these two guys here. But so I grew up in Indiana, and my whole life grew up playing basketball because that was the thing you do. Boy or girl, you always just played basketball. So I always grew up playing sports, did that, ran track, cross country, did cheer a little bit. So sports had always been a part of my life, but I never thought that this would be a career I could do, especially with what I do now. That wasn't really a thing back when I was younger, to be a videographer, especially for a girl sports videographer. So getting into college, I really didn't know what I wanted to do. So I was like, I'll be a dentist, super random, but I was like, I like teeth. It's an easy job. You can get a job anywhere kind of a thing. So I did that for a few years, or for my first year, my undergrad, and absolutely hated it because I've always been a really creative person. I love making videos. When I was younger, I would make YouTube videos like with my cousins, have them, act stuff out, and I'd be a director, video editing. Like, it's always been a huge part of my life too. And so in college, I was like, I don't want to be a dentist for the rest of my life. I won't enjoy what I'm doing. And I was like, well, what's one thing that I really do love doing? Making videos. And I love sports. So I was trying to look and see what I could do with that. So luckily for me, and thankfully my parents supported me through this, they're like, you're leaving dental school to go be a journalist, sure. And so I ended up going to IU. I transferred from IUPUI to IU and did broadcast journalism. Took my first few classes, and I got the chance to be a sideline reporter for a Big Ten student network. I applied, and they let me do it, which was really cool. So I got to do sideline reporting for IU men's basketball, which is a huge honor to be able to do, and women's basketball. And then I did some field hockey, taught myself some field hockey. And I was hooked, like he said earlier. It was just something I love, being able to relate to people, because people watch sports to get away from either their everyday lives, or they love watching it because it's a team. It's something that connects them with someone. So I loved it, got hooked. And something that was really cool with the school that they allowed us to do is the sideline reporting, but also we got to make videos for the team, help cover them. So I just got a lot of really cool opportunities, and knew this was something that I wanted to do for the rest of my life. And thankfully, one of the big things I think we'll probably talk about is making connections and getting to know people in the business. So thankfully, one of my friends at IU, she had this job before me. She now works at ESPN. She covers the Vikings. And she had told my sports director at IU, she was like, hey, this job is open. It's going to be a great first step for you. You get to cover the SEC, Ole Miss, Mississippi State. People down here love football. So it's going to be really cool, great hospitable place. And so I applied, ended up getting the job. And I've been here for 1.5 years now, and it's been such a blessing getting to cover 2 amazing teams. I've gotten to go to 2 College World Series now.
Yeah.
Outback Bowl for Mississippi State. I got to go to postseason basketball. So I couldn't have asked for a better first job, and it's been rolling ever since.
You've been in Mississippi for 1.5 years.
Yes.
So I want to, you hit on a couple of things there I want to go ahead and dig into. So tell us a little bit more about your position at the Clarion Ledger, what all you do, and because I think that is it's sort of a unique, and as you said, it didn't really exist not that long ago.
Yeah, so basically, my official title is Digital Sports Reporter and Videographer. So coming into this job, this was the first time they had ever had this job because the girl before me, she dabbled in video, but when I came, they officially wanted to make just a video position, which is really cool. And they knew the stuff that I did making my YouTube videos back in the day, and Sideline would really be good for this job. So basically what I do is like during the week, or if I find something really cool, I'll do a really cool feature story on someone. If it's an athlete, I just got done filming one for the Mississippi School for the Deaf, so we're doing something on that team. And it kind of varies week by week, but I try to do feature stories that includes video, and that's not me on screen necessarily, and I'll make packages that way. And then obviously with Ole Miss and Mississippi State, cover them during the week, go to some press conferences, make feature content with athletes, and then game day, cover game day, and do everything that comes with that. But one of the things I love about covering Mississippi State and Ole Miss is doing those feature videos. So one really cool video that I did that I loved being able to do was Cooper Johnson, the catcher here. I got to sit down, paint his fingernails, and do an interview with him because a lot of people don't know catchers paint their fingernails. So that was a really cool feature video that I did. Yeah, so that's something I did. Just really cool, fun stuff like that. I have a lot of freedom to do that, which is really nice.
Yeah, and so now, Rick, you used to work at the Clarion Ledger, and did you ever sit down with any catchers and paint any fingernails?
I was a catcher, and I never painted my fingernail.
It's the new wave.
I was a catcher. No, I never did. I never did that.
And so from your time there and to the shifting that we've seen in a print product like the Clarion Ledger that now exists both in print and in an online environment, and there's this video element to it. Can you talk a little bit just about what changes you've seen across that type of medium?
Oh yeah, I mean, when I first started in the newspaper business, I wrote my stories on a portable manual typewriter and called them in and read them to somebody in rewrite who, hopefully heard well and typed well, but not always. No, it's been so many changes. I remember when we first, you'll remember this, Dwayne, when we had the porter bubble machines.
Yes.
Before computers, they had something called porter bubbles, and you type your stories into them, and then you stick the phone into it, and it would transmit it back to the office. But they had some kinks they had to work out, and one time I was covering a game, Alcorn, Mississippi State basketball game. The crowd's really into it, and every time the sound got really loud, my computer screen just started, my porter bubble screen just started making all kinds of symbols and stuff and I'd lose the story every time. So, there's been a lot of things that have happened, and it wasn't always smoothly either. It was, I guess it was like 15 years ago that they told me at the Clarion Ledger that more people were reading my columns on their telephone than they were reading it in the newspaper. That was a that was a eureka moment that I never thought I'd see. But I do think that, and I don't know if this is what you wanted to get into, but I do think that newspapers went about switching from mainly the newspaper itself to online. I don't think that there was a lot of R&D that went into it.
Yeah.
I remember the first meeting that corporate had down at the Clarion Ledger when they told us they were going to make our website the emphasis instead of the newspaper. And I said, okay, how much are you going to charge for the website? And they said, nothing, it's going to be free. And I remember saying to the guy, look, I can't hardly even balance my own banking account, but I can tell you, if you're going to give away something that we've sold for 100 years, that's bad business. And it turns out it was really, really bad business.
Yeah.
You know, they should have figured out a way to charge for it before they did it, gave it away.
Well, and so print products have, of course, had to shift into this multimedia environment, you know. But then, now, Dwayne, you work for ESPN, which started off as just a broadcast, but then they've developed into a multi-platform environment. Can you talk a little bit, or just kind of tell us about, because I'm very curious about the investigative side and the reporting side that you kind of man at ESPN.
Right. Well, I mean, certainly ESPN is, you know, multimedia, different platforms. In fact, we just ended regular circulation of our magazine, which had 2 million magazines printed a month. And now we're only printing 2 magazines a year. That's the football issue and the body issue. Other than that, everything is online. And we've started a service, an OTT service called ESPN Plus. So we're trying to keep up with the times. We're trying to be smart about it, you know, and deliberate about it, but, you know, keep up with everything. In terms of the investigative reporting and how that works across all the platforms. First, just with the investigative reporting itself, you know, a lot of people still don't know that ESPN is heavily into the investigative and enterprise reporting area. In fact, you know, don't quote me on this, but I think my team at ESPN might be the largest investigative team in any news organization in America. If you take the digital folks and you take the TV folks, we probably got over 40 people. I read somewhere that the New York Times had about 10 or 12 people in their investigative unit. So if that's true, we're 3 to 4 times as big as the New York Times. And that was a couple of years ago. I read that. Maybe they've beefed up their investigative team. But ESPN has been very serious about it because we think a lot of the major issues that face journalism and face America as a society, you can see those issues reflected in sports. You know, I mean, you look at what's going on now, even in the political landscape, oftentimes politicians of both stripes, they try to use sports to make their point. You see LeBron James or athletes like that, they're constantly asked questions about politics. So the investigative reporting in sports is very, very important. I mean, we have done a lot of stories on, you know, the head injuries in the NFL, steroids in baseball, and it seems to be cyclical. Mm-hmm. When I started this, the investigative television unit at ESPN in 2007, for those first 3 or 4 years, it seems like it was all Roger Clemens, Alex Rodriguez, Barry Bonds. It was baseball, baseball, baseball. And then around 2010 to around 2015, and people were saying, well, you're not doing anything on the NFL. By 2010, it was all CTE, brain injuries, and for like 5 years, we were just doing a lot of that stuff. And then around 2015 to now, a lot of sexual assault on campus by college athletes. Mm-hmm. So this stuff seems to be cyclical. But, you know, we feel investigative reporting is very, very important. And I will say that as newspapers have been gutted, I think it's incumbent upon ESPN, Sports Illustrated, HBO Real Sports, some of the bigger national media to really pick that up and to do the investigative reporting. I will say the story that I'm proud of is our work on the NFL and the concussion crisis. We did a story a few years ago about some research money with the NFL, and it led to some congressional hearings. and they called the NFL into the hearings, and Jeff Miller, the senior vice president for the NFL, acknowledged in those hearings that playing football is dangerous to your health. It was the first time that the NFL had ever publicly acknowledged that. So this work, whether it's by ESPN or by a local newspaper in Mississippi, is very important. And the last thing I'll say on that, when you're talking about football being dangerous to your health, people will say to me if I go out and speak, so you're anti-football. I am not. I'm a Cleveland Browns season ticket holder. I love football. And I think college athletes, they get a scholarship for playing football. NFL athletes make millions of dollars. The question is, should an 8-year-old kid with a big head and a little neck be playing tackle football? And my thing is public awareness for parents.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned politics and the lines that have kind of gotten blurred recently. Can any of you talk about how any of the dealing with that and being a reporter has affected your reporting, or how you've handled any issues of trying to deal with politics? Are you able to? Is it getting harder to stay sort of the neutral voice and to stay on the sidelines and to be the informer, or are you feeling pressure from one side or the other?
I mean, I think for me, the most I see when it comes to people getting mad about a stance on politics comes from social media. Because if you're posting something or liking something or even following a politician, someone's going to say something to you or mention it. But for the most part, I haven't really had to deal a whole lot with having to pick a side publicly or anything like that. But like I said, mostly social media is where I see that go on.
I've just, on Twitter, I've basically had to put a muffler on myself, as far as politics. I mean, something that happened this morning is, what's the woman's name that is Trump's spokesperson?
Kellyanne Conway?
No, not her, the other one, the one that does his Twitter account and all that. Anyway, she tweeted out this morning that Tate Reeves had been 10 percentage points behind in the governor's race here until Trump made his visit to Tupelo, and basically saying that he saved the day, that Trump came in and put Tate Reeves over the top. And I just tweeted out that I think what it said is, have you no shame? He never was even behind, much less by double digits, you know. I mean, it was just a bald-faced lie that she put out. So I tweeted that out, and then I immediately get, replies saying, you need to stick to sports, your liberal colors are showing, and all this kind of stuff. And
how do you handle that? Yeah.
So I've just, basically, I try my best, but every once in a while I slip.
It's hard because you want to be like a normal, I guess, have a stance like everyone else can say they have. But yeah, you do definitely have to be.
But see, Rick's a personality. And, so I'm sure it's hard for him because he's used to, commenting. When it comes to like what I do, we just really stick to reporting the news. But I can remember in 2012 on Outside the Lines, we were doing the stories about whatever happened to athletes' activism. We used to talk about Jim Brown and Wilt Chamberlain, Bill Russell, and Muhammad Ali, how active they were. And, all the athletes today seem to follow the Michael Jordan, Republicans buy sneakers too. And athletes weren't saying much. But then in the last 2 or 3 years, some of that has changed. But, at ESPN, we are not a political network, and we do not cover politics as a staple of what we do, but we cover sports, and sports and politics are inextricably linked. They always have been, all the way back to the Olympics in Germany, to Jackie Robinson, and not just on racial issues, on all sorts of issues. So the one thing that I like about ESPN, and especially the areas I work in, E60, Outside the Lines, there's no muzzle put on us. We can cover, we did a special a few years ago, not even on politics, on a 1 hour special. And I know it made everybody at ESPN nervous, but we pulled it off and they let us put it on the use of the N word in sports. And we ended up winning a New York Festival World's Best TV and Film Award for it because we handled it, I think, really, really well, and we found articulate people. But as a sports network, you do not want to cover politics, but you do not want to stay away from the issues either.
Absolutely. Well, and you guys all hit over. You were talking about social media, and so let's talk a little bit about how that has changed the game of being a sports writer today. I mean, Rick and Dwayne, when you guys started, you wrote what you wrote, you covered who you covered, and you put it out, and that was that. And now, how do you deal with an environment where the audience talks back?
It's actually kind of fun, some of it. I mean, what it's made it into is almost like you're on call 24 hours. Mm-hmm. You're never really off the clock, and you have to really be aware. I mean, you have to. I'm reading a lot of Twitter accounts that I really don't care about, just in case the quarterback at Mississippi State says
right,
has something newsworthy on his Twitter account.
And you're sifting through a bunch of kids being kids.
Yeah, right. Right. So that part of it I don't really like.
Yeah. How about dealing with fans or just the pressure of having everything be 24/7?
Well, I know for me, like literally 95% of my job is strictly online because I don't really write for the newspaper because I'm the videographer. So all of what I do, it's based on, will fans like this, or is this what needs to be said? This is, so a lot of what I do, it does give kind of, not an anxiety, but when you put a video out that you're really proud of, or something you really like and everyone likes it, but one person's like, what are you wearing? Or why are you wearing that shirt? And I'm like, did you like the video though?
Yeah.
So I've learned to get tougher skin when it comes to that, but nowhere near the level of what you guys are as far as that. But
well, and for us, it's a great promotional tool.
Yeah.
If we have a big story coming on linear TV, for instance, we can let people know if we have a big interview. The give and take with the fans, it is what it is. I'm happy that the fans and the regular, Joe and Jane have a voice, and we're not the gatekeepers that we were back when I started in the, late 80s, early 90s. And I think overall it's pretty good. But sometimes fans, they love their teams. I remember when we were doing investigations of Ohio State, and we've had to do two, one in the Jim Tressel era, one in the Urban Meyer era. And I led a lot of that, and I'm an Ohio State grad. And at the time, Vince Doria, the former famed Boston Globe editor and ESPN executive producer, was my boss. We're both Ohio State grads. When we were writing about Jim Tressel, I would look at Ohio State fan boards and they would say, those guys who are doing this over at ESPN, they must be Michigan Wolverines. We were Buckeyes, but we have to do our jobs. But it's good to hear back from the fans.
Yeah, it's huge opportunities, like I said, for a reporter to get their message out there, to get their reporting seen or read by people that it wouldn't otherwise do. It's just it's a change, a shift in a medium. It's now a major medium for the way that we can convey our reporting. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've written columns for my opinion for, 40-something years in Mississippi, and it's like the Ole Miss. Through the years, the Ole Miss people have thought I was a state sympathizer, and the state people thought I was an Ole Miss sympathizer, and the Ole Miss and the Southern Miss people thought I was a traitor. Because that's where I went to school. Yeah. So, I mean, you're really, if you're going to write columns for sure, you better have, thick skin.
Yeah.
And I think also too, to add to that, if if that's what you're wanting to go into, is something that's based around social media or doing video, you need to be active on social media, whether you like that or not, because that's how you're going to best get your message out there, especially in today's world where the newspaper, like you said, is getting gutted, where we might not even have any newspapers in 10, 20 years, like physical copies. You got to get good on social media, know how to do SEO, know how to have great headlines, tags, and just be a part of the culture, like what's going on, how are kids younger than you, 10 years younger than you, going to relate to what you're putting out, or people older than you, and vice versa.
Yeah. I'm curious, I think you'll all three have different perspectives on this, but everybody in here has a bit of a preconceived notion about what a sports reporter is and what their daily life looks like, right? It's almost like the meme, like my mom thinks I do this, my boss thinks I do this, what I actually do is this. Most people think sports reporters, simply, show up at 5 o'clock in their shorts and their Hawaiian shirts and eat hot dogs and talk to athletes. And it's just the greatest job in the world. And it is, but there's several other aspects about it that people don't know about. So could each of you kind of just go through and tell us what a typical day might be like in your world?
Yeah, well, for me, game day, I'll take game day. That's one of the craziest days. So I live in Jackson, which means I'm 2 hours from Mississippi State or 2.5 from Ole Miss. So typically you want to arrive like 2-ish hours before a game starts, which means I got to wake up a little over 4 hours before I have to get on the road. So if it's an early game, then I got to wake up at like 4 a.m. sometimes. So depending on when that happens, like I said, 4.5 hours. So get to the game, getting ready, getting set up, making sure everything's good to go, everything's charged, maybe go talk to some friends, go set up in the press room for when the press conference goes on after the game. And then, 3-4 hours later after the game, 2 hours after that, you're still making content and you're still producing what you need to do. You're getting on the phone with your sports editor, whoever that may be, making sure they saw the video, making sure it's good, what it needs to be for for whoever's writing a column or a sidebar. And then, driving home unless I have a hotel. So there have been a lot of nights I've been on the road at 4 a.m. So it's a long, long day on game day, but it's worth it.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm sure you can relate.
Yeah, I've been there and done that for a long time. I've got the best job in the world now. I work out of my house and I write. My contract calls for 3 columns a week, and basically I wake up every morning and try to think of. I read for about 2 or 3 hours with coffee in the morning, trying to figure out what would be the most interesting and compelling thing that I could write that Mississippians would appreciate.
Yeah.
I hate to say, a lot of times I'm working in my recliner. It's the truth. Again, it's the best job I've ever had. The hardest part is to find the right story, because what we all are at the end of the day is storytellers. Our mediums are different. I mean, you have a different medium than I do, and Dwayne has a different medium. But we're telling stories, and we need to tell interesting, compelling stories.
Yeah.
Something that you can't get anywhere else.
Right, and that's. I mean, you work for the Clarion Ledger and I work for Mississippi Today, and a lot of times I'm trying to think about what I can tell my readers that they can't get in the Clarion Ledger.
Exactly. Yep.
And what Mackenzie talks about, I've been there, especially during the time period where I was running the Dallas Cowboy coverage. I had sort of the same routine that was even before where they're playing now. We were going to Texas Stadium. But today, I'll give you a more typical day of like a big show like E60 that we're doing on Sunday morning. We wake up pretty early and we get there at about 6 o'clock because it's going to go on national TV at 9 o'clock Eastern, 8 o'clock Central. But, you know, we're getting there. We're having production meetings before he retired. We're dealing with, you know, our talent like Bob Lee, and now it's Ryan Smith and Jeremy Schaap, and reading all their scripts, and we're getting in the control room, and we're trying to get this show on television. We're trying to put out a really good show, and we're done by 10 o'clock and have our post meeting, and we're out of there by 11, but we may have been up since, 4 or 5 in the morning starting that.
Right. Yeah, it's weird hours. When fans, the game ends, and if they're still there when the game ends, they go straight home or straight to the bar. Whereas you've got hours left to do, or when you're doing a show, you've got all of this that goes into it.
I can tell you these mediums are so different too, especially my transition from newspapers to TV. I went from running Dallas Cowboy coverage for the Dallas Morning News to when I went to ESPN, I was on Monday Night Football, and our very first game was in Dallas. It was the game that Tony Romo replaced Drew Bledsoe, and Bill Parcells was the coach. But one of the interesting things is, as a sports reporter in the press box, a lot of the action started towards the end of the game. You make your way down to the field, you're in the locker room. On Monday Night Football, it was when that game was over. We've been in that town since Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. We interview the home team on Saturday, the visiting team on Monday. We gear up everything for Monday Night Football. And when that fourth quarter ends, we're in a bus and we're headed to the airport, out of town, home for a day, and we're preparing for the next Monday Night Football game. So, and the other thing that was so interesting, and you talk about, this is more of a corporate media thing. As a newspaper reporter, you have limited access, and I think some people in here, you talk about the access you might get with Ole Miss football and basketball. As a corporate partner at ESPN, I had unbelievable access to these players, to the Dallas Cowboys. Like, if you cover an NFL team, you don't get any access on Saturday or Sundays. I just told you, I'm with the team. I was with Bill Parcells and Tony Romo on a Saturday. And then you're with these coaches. So it is a very interesting thing, spending 18 years in print and newspapers and then going to ESPN and actually being part of the game production, but still being a journalist. This is just a very interesting thing.
Can you guys talk a little bit about access? And do you see any changes or shifts in the areas of being able to get access to do your jobs?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, lots. I mean, just college sports coverage. You used to could have access to players after every practice, after every game. You didn't have to give the SID a list of who you wanted to talk to and hope they were going to be benevolent. You know. Now, what. Somebody tell me, at Ole Miss, you got one day you can talk to the offense, one day to the defense, but only the selected players that they'll give you.
Yeah, you got to ask like a few days in advance.
Yeah, so that's changed totally. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's changed a lot with. I still do a lot of Saints stuff. It's changed an awful lot with the Saints as well with NFL. You just don't have as much access as you used to.
Yeah, NCAA rules make it a little bit more difficult with having to ask a few days in advance and getting one day for offense, one day for defense. But another thing that's really changed the way you see, get access is now you're seeing schools, like here, Ole Miss Sports Productions, and even at Mississippi State, they have Hail State Productions, where they have their own production team putting out YouTube videos, social media. So they're getting the stories any access they want, because obviously they work for the school and the team, so they know stuff that we don't know. So when they're putting out videos on certain athletes and stories, it's like, how did I not know about that? Mm-hmm. But thankfully, one of the things about being here for a year and a half now is I've gotten to know the players and the coaches a little bit more, so I have a little bit more of an idea of what's going on in their lives. And thankfully, both schools have been really helpful and let me get access when I want, but it's also very limited where like NCAA rules mandates like they can't eat anything that you give them and stuff like that, because I tried to do like a fun food eating video, but obviously you can't do that because the rules. But I mean, access is yeah, it's like you said, it's gotten a little bit more difficult, I guess. In a
Are
sense.
there any Ole Miss lady golfers in here? Some of you may have seen that this past weekend, one of them, a junior from Louisiana, shot 61 in a tournament in Mexico. Mm-hmm. That's unbelievable. She shot 11 under par. She made 10 birdies and an eagle and no bogeys in a round of golf. So that piqued my interest. I mean, what does it feel like to shoot 61, you know? A junior in college, she just blew the tournament field away. So I started trying to get in touch with her on Monday morning, and I was told finally yesterday that by NCAA rules she has today off and Thursday off, but I can talk to her on Friday at 3:00, which will be 6 days after she shot 61.
Yeah.
You know, so I'm not. Some of it I don't think works.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not doing the Ole Miss golf program any good. It's not doing her any good.
Yeah, and then you've got, like Mackenzie said, the in-house productions have amped up so much.
You got to get tight with those guys.
You know.
You got to get tight because if something's going down, they might tell you, and yeah.
Well, and my question is, how does that in-house, that is a relatively new animal, and it's mostly Dwayne's fault because of ESPN's money that has built the production companies that basically live within a modern athletic department now. How does is that a good thing for the public? What problems do you see with in-house reporting versus an external media outlet coverage like what you guys do?
I think it's good for in-house in the sense that obviously it's building up the athletic program. It's making them look good because if athletes see themselves on Twitter doing something cool with the football or whatnot, that's just going to help recruit those kids here. And I mean, it helps if you stay in-house to get their message out that they went out. But also it's hard for us journalists when it's like, well, we want just as much access as them, but you can't, in a sense, get that reciprocated because it's like, well, this kid, like you said, has today, tomorrow off, but he can't talk at this time. But it's like, but you can do it, So It's just figuring out ways to get the content that you need to get and, do something a little bit different than in-house.
Let's face it, athletes and athletic departments, they want to control their own message. I mean, we've talked a lot here about whether it's Ole Miss or at the collegiate level, but it's also happening at other levels. You have the Players Tribune, where a lot of professional athletes and even college athletes, they're writing their own stories or somebody's ghostwriting their stories for them. So they want that because those are hagiographies and it's going to make them look good. But that is not journalism. I'm not saying the Players Tribune is not journalism at all, but I feel, and in the area that I work in, and I know everybody's not fortunate enough to do that, that we have to have a watchdog function. I mean, because they are not going to tell the stories that do you think the stuff that we just won a Peabody for at Michigan State, and not only Dr. Larry Nassar, but what was going on in the basketball and football program? I mean, we started that in 2014. We didn't print that until 2019. Now, we weren't working on it full time, took some time off, did other things, but that's 5 years, and only journalists are going to do that. And I'm not touting ESPN's horn because you have other really good journalism out there. There's Yahoo is still doing good journalism. Sports Illustrated does some good journalism. Local newspapers, the New York Times, there's a lot of it out there, and that's what we got to focus on. And then on the other stuff, I think media, whether it's newspapers or ESPN or whatever, we can still be creative and fun because, I think the audience wants more than just watchdog journalism. It wants, so we do the features, we do all sorts of things, but we gotta, make sure we're focusing on journalism. And the other thing is access is very important if you're a beat writer. I've covered beats at newspapers, I've supervised beats, but sometimes when you don't have access, you can still do the story. Do a different story. They'll get tired of seeing those different stories, and maybe they'll give you access.
Absolutely. Well, you've talked a little bit about this changing in the industry, and particularly corporate journalism, and the way that has shifted what you do. Where do you see the future of sports journalism headed, particularly with Gannett or ESPN? What is going to be the model going forward that makes sports journalism viable?
Well, I think, I've got so many friends now working for The Athletic, which is a subscription-based, strictly online publication where their overhead is not very, it's not that high. Dwayne and I were discussing earlier whether we think that the long-term model will work or not. I sure hope it does, because I'm going to have literally dozens of friends out of work if it doesn't make it. But I think that right now that may be the model for the future. I work for a nonprofit newspaper. I'm an independent contractor, but my biggest contract is with Mississippi Today, which is a nonprofit, which we don't depend on ad sales. We don't depend on subscription. We don't sell subscriptions. We depend on grants and donations. And there's models like that working. There's one in Memphis that's working really well. There's one in Austin, Texas, the Texas Tribune, that's working really well. ProPublica, lots of nonprofit news, which I think is going to be a big part of journalism's future.
Sure.
I think another thing for me that I hope continues is seeing a lot more diversity in journalism, because I know, growing up, I didn't see a whole lot of women or anyone other than white males on TV or even writing. So I think it's really cool, the new wave of young kids, at least my age too, that I'm seeing getting in the workforce, just a diverse amount of people, which will obviously bring a lot more different views and whatnot to the topics and sports in general. But I think that's another thing that I'm hoping to see continue, is just seeing.
Do you run into any challenges related to that? Could you talk a little bit about being sort of a female reporter in a male-dominated business historically?
For me, I know, at least for me, I try and take it as working harder than, I guess, other people around me to prove myself and prove to others that I am here and this is what I want to do. Because I've seen so many comments, especially when I first got the job, oh, she's just a girl from Indiana. What does she know about Southern sports or Southern culture? Or like I mentioned earlier, what is she wearing? So you get comments like that, but I don't really let them bother me too much. I just try and focus on the job, what I'm doing, but making sure that I'm coming up with that original content that not everyone else is doing, and making an effort to try and collaborate with other people, and pretty much stuff like that.
Rick, you mentioned earlier that regardless of all of our mediums, you're all storytellers, and the key to good storytelling is people, and there's no better, more interesting people that you interact with than being a sports reporter. And so, Dwayne, could you start off, but could you guys just talk to us a little bit about maybe who the most interesting person you've ever interviewed is, or what maybe one of your favorite reporting stories involving a sports figure that we might know?
Well, the most interesting person I ever interviewed was when I was on Monday Night Football. We're in that small group setting, and we were doing the Indianapolis Colts game, and we interviewed Peyton Manning. Peyton Manning I'm an investigative reporter now, so I tend to look at it from that side of things, but Peyton Manning was just wickedly funny. He was like, that interview we did for Monday Night Football. He was talking about meeting the Queen of England. And he said, like, when he's Peyton Manning. She had no idea who he was or what football was. And they told him, he said, like, I went to talk to her and they said, don't put your hand out. You got to let the Queen of England put your hand out. And he's like, I'm Peyton Manning. And then when they had the dinner, she was speaking. They set Peyton way in the back and they set his wife up front. And he's like, why is she up front? But Peyton is literally the most interesting athlete and funniest athlete, and I hope one day we can get him to work for ESPN.
I'm gonna riff off of the Peyton Manning thing because when he was a 16-year-old junior at Newman High School in New Orleans,
Oh my God.
I was the first guy to interview him. I mean, I went in there drove down from Jackson. His daddy was Archie Manning, the all-time Mississippi sports legend, and he was a sophomore. And we went to a restaurant. I asked him if he'd had lunch, and he said no, and we went to an old New Orleans restaurant called Uglisich's, and he told me what to order. And I interviewed him, and I swear to God, Dwayne, it was like interviewing a 15-year NFL veteran. He was so prepared. He was so well-spoken. He thought about everything he said before he said it.
Right.
And it was like, I'll never forget that. I mean, he was 16 years old going on 35,
Right. I mean, I will say it again. I am not his agent, and I'm not an Indianapolis Colts fan or Denver Broncos fan, but I think he might have a second act somewhere, and I think the public will enjoy it.
Yeah, for sure.
Love Peyton Manning. I was going to say him too, and you guys both stole him. One of the really
You interviewed Peyton Manning?
Yeah, actually, funny story. Well, it was kind of an interview. So the Neshoba County Fair, I don't know how many of you guys know what that is. I didn't know his family has a spot there. And one of my good photographer friends, I was just walking around at the fair because I had never been there before. He was like, "You're from Indiana, aren't you?" And I was like, "Yeah, why?" He's like, "You know Peyton Manning?" And my heart dropped. I was like, "Do I know Peyton Manning? Grew up loving him, yes." And he's like, "Yeah, him and Archie and their family have a little cabin over here. You want to go meet them?" And I was like I blacked out. I was like, gotta be professional because I'm a journalist. And I got to meet him. And he was the nicest person ever. Got to talk to Archie, which, oh my gosh, a legend. And just got to hang out with them at their little cabin at the Neshoba County Fair for a little bit. So that was definitely, I asked him a bunch of questions and whatnot. So that was probably one of the coolest interviews. But one of the coolest, I don't know. I've got to meet Herschel Walker. That was a really cool one. He was at the Sanderson Farms championship game or championship tournament last year. Got to talk to him a little bit while he was out there, and got to ask him if he still does 100 push-ups and sit-ups a day. And he started laughing. But this job's really cool because you get to meet people like that, from what we do at random events, I guess.
Yeah.
So,
RJ, the most interesting person I ever interviewed to do a story was Red Smith,
Okay.
the columnist for the New York Times, Pulitzer-winning columnist. I was just getting started in the business, and I was about 20, I think I was 21, and he was over 70, and he was in the twilight of his career, and gosh, he was just so well-spoken, and I'd read his columns. I used to go to the library in Hattiesburg to read the New York Times, to read his columns. And he's had, some of us someday get one book published that's called like the best of so-and-so. He had like it took 5 books that were the best of Red Smith, the Red Smith Reader. He's just the best columnist I've ever read, and it's still my favorite interview I ever did.
At this point, we'd like to see if there's any questions from the audience. We've got a couple of people with a couple of microphones, and so if you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll bring you a microphone. One right here.
This question's for the panel, but I'd like Dwayne's reaction. ESPN just came out with its greatest games of the last 150 years. And I was looking forward to that list. I'm alumnus of the University of Southern California. And I thought for sure there would be one game, and it would be, if not number one, within the top 10. It didn't make the list. That game occurred in September of 1970, Alabama and USC. We all know what happened in that game, don't we?
Right, we do. And I can't actually, that when that panel was put together, the College 150, I was an original member of that, and I went to about 2 meetings, and then I didn't go to any more meetings. I don't even know who's on the list, so I can't answer, but I definitely can put you in touch with the person.
For those in the audience, that was the game that integrated football at the University of Alabama.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Because Sam Cunningham plays for SC. And the story that might be apocryphal, but it has lasted since that game, is that after the game, SC ends up winning. Coach Bear Bryant goes into the...
Professor Burson, it was Nebraska at the top of that list.
I know it was. I'm saying, but Coach Bryant goes into the SC locker room, asks John McKay, can I bring Sam Cunningham into my locker room? It's the first time a black athlete had been in that locker room.
Yep.
And
Absolutely.
on that point alone, I thought that that game merited that type of attention.
The next year's was pretty good too.
Well, that's when Alabama beat them.
Yeah, went to the wishbone.
That's right.
Yeah.
Other questions?
We're definitely aware of that game.
Yeah.
And again, I think as a game, it probably, I'm just speculating, didn't make the top 10, but it certainly had huge implications, and everybody knows, that story is a great story.
My question is for the panel as well. It's an NFL question. We all know the 3 major sports in America is NBA, MLB, NFL. Mm-hmm. Between those 3 sports, NFL has the highest probability of injury, and they're the most popular of those 3 in America. Why does that NFL have the lowest player salary than the other 2? Why is that? When you have such a high risk of CTE, concussions, and things of that nature, but if you stack them up against the NBA and the MLB, their player salaries is significantly lower.
I would say the players' union in the NFL historically hasn't been as strong as the players' union in the other 2 professional sports. By the way, you say that the top 2 sports in this country are pro football and college football, by the way. Those are the top 2 sports.
Professional. I'm sorry, I should say professional.
And then, so it's the players' union that the NFL hasn't been as strong, or the league office in the NFL has been stronger than the other league offices. Also, then I think you just have to look at volume. You're playing 82 regular season NBA games, 162 regular MLB games versus 16 NFL games. And that's probably enough, even though the league wants 18 games. So I think it's volume. I think it's representation and those sorts of things.
Oh, I got so many more questions. I have so many more questions. Back to college football. Will we ever expand the playoffs?
I think we all hope so. I mean, this is just my guess. And again, I'm not a columnist. This is the columnist here. I don't get paid for my opinion. But I do think that it will eventually go to at least 8.
Follow the money.
Okay.
Money will demand that
And
they
fans will
expand
demand.
it.
One more question and I'll pass the mic. Since we just got this, players are now able to profit off their likeness, do you think that's going to open up like floodgates for the media to feel more entitled to come at these players now that they're basically making money doing what has never been made money before in a college athlete?
You mean have access to the players more?
Or media in general, not just reporters, but like fans. Like I know fans are pretty like hostile because they feel entitled, like, oh, this is my school, you're playing for my school, I'm gonna tweet snap whatever to you to make you feel my emotions. Do you think that now that people know that it was under the table at first, but now that it's like, okay, it's fine, it's legal now, that people are going to feel entitled to do that even more, if not, consistently already?
I don't know about that because we don't know how this is going to look, how it's going to end up. And I think eventually we'll find out what this means and how it's going to look. But I think fans already on social media are pretty aggressive, but I don't know if they're going to be more aggressive.
Yeah, I've seen some people tweet about it, but I think regardless, people on Twitter will say whatever they want. I think it's going to be more of like, are they going to buy more stuff from this player or whatnot? That's a good question. I don't know.
Certainly takes no knowledge to tweet. You can tweet. Anybody can tweet.
Anyone can tweet from him.
We have time for one more. Do we have one more
I don't want to
question?
get a student's question. Go ahead and let the
Yeah.
student ask.
If y'all could, I just wanted y'all to touch on how y'all go about planning, just kind of the process, whether it's the videos that you do, the storyboarding for that, or like you mentioned earlier, you kind of read in the mornings to kind of get an idea of how you want to prepare your columns. And then also on the investigative side with the E60, that's a longer form content, just kind of the whole planning production process that y'all go through. for your
Real
pieces.
quickly, I can just say that I get about 2,000 story ideas a year in-house. We don't really take them from outside, and they can come from anybody, from the lady in the cafeteria to the president of the company, producers, reporters. And for the long form stories, of those 2,000 stories, we'll probably do about 60. I'm not that good at math, but that's about 2%. So because long form TV stories are very, very expensive. So I can tell you that's how our process works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've already touched on it. I generally get up in the morning and read for a couple hours and try to come up with an idea. As far as the writing process itself, my daddy gave me some advice a long time ago that I use almost every day. Is the first story I ever wrote, he came back home with me. I'm 13 years old, and I roll the paper in the typewriter, and he leaves the room. He comes back in 30 minutes later, and the paper's still just as white as it can be. And he said something I can't say right now. He basically said, "What's wrong, son?" And I said, "I can't get started. I can't figure out how to get started." And he said, "Well, if I was you, I would write it the way I'd tell it. Like if I was telling somebody the story, just write it that way." And I still use that all the time if I'm having trouble getting, because you think about it, if I'm telling you a story, I want to hook you first. I want to get your attention. And then I want to keep it. I want you to read the whole. I want you to listen to me. I want you to hear my whole story. And so that's a device I've used all my life, and I highly recommend it.
For me, for my videos, usually if I don't have an idea or I'm needing to come up with some content for like a feature video or something, usually I'll go straight to social media. And if there's like an athlete that's, going off, or someone that I think's gonna have a really good season or gonna have a really good game, I'll go to their social media. And I'll kind of stalk them a little bit on, Instagram or Twitter, and kind of see what they like, what they're tweeting or replying. Because a lot of times that's where you can get some really cool story ideas if an athlete likes an artist for some reason, or if they're putting out tweets like, "Go donate to this charity or this cause." You're like, well, why? So usually it starts with an idea like that. And once I get an idea, I'm like, oh, I can do a feature video. How much access do I have? Can I get the player? Can I get the player's mom, a coach? What kind of access can I get? Because sometimes it's a lot harder if you're wanting to do a cool feature story. Like I did one on Mac Brown, here at Ole Miss, his lemonade stand, and I was like, well, he's from Minnesota. How could I get footage of him and his lemonade stand up in Minnesota? Well, thankfully I got some footage from the Ole Miss production team who had it, and they gave it to me, let me use that. And I got to talk to his parents because they flew in. So I was like, that'd be a perfect video. So got to sit down and talk to him. His parents asked him about the lemonade stand, why did they start doing it, how much they've donated. And then once I get all that, I figure out how I want to tell the story. Because you want them to tell the story. You don't want necessarily, I don't want to go in there and have to do a voiceover. I want them to be able to tell it themselves. So I figure out the best way I can do that. And usually I go in my Final Cut Pro or Premiere, whatever editing system you use. I start chopping up clips of what sound bites I want to use most likely. Start putting in some B-roll. And then usually after that, it starts coming to me how I want to edit it, move it around. But just starting from the basics, figuring out what I've got, what I need, what I can add. That was a long answer. I'm sorry.
Good process. I think we're officially out of time, but I know all three of these people would love to have some more questions and interact with you in the few minutes after. I asked them who their most interesting person they've ever interviewed was, and so as the only person on this panel to have never talked to Peyton Manning, I have to say that you three have probably been the most interesting interview I've ever had, and so let's give them a round of applause. Thanks.